So, the Holy Land may loom large in our minds for a number of reasons, but the size of the geography is not one of them. And so for centuries, the area that was known as the Levant, that's what's now Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, West Bank, Gaza, and some would include Cyprus. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And after the Ottoman defeat in World War I, the League of Nations authorized a British mandate over the former Ottoman province of Palestine. The Ottoman province of Palestine, under the British mandate, with the right there, was at the time populated mostly by Arabs, both Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs, but also had a Jewish population that traced its presence there back centuries. And even before the mandate, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote in 1917 to Baron Lionel Rothschild, who's one of the leaders of Britain's Jewish community at the time, calling for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And with the Zionist movement in Europe that arose in the late 19th century, with virulent anti-Semitism in Europe, with the Nazi persecution, and with the reluctance of other countries to accept Holocaust survivors after World War II, the Jewish share of the population, the Zionist share of the population of in 1917, when Lord Balfour gave the declaration, to over 30% by 1947. This obviously raised tensions between the Arab communities and the Zionist communities. The British proved unable to quell these tensions, to stop the violence that was growing between these two communities. And the British said to the newly created United Nations, okay, that's it, we give up. We're giving up the mandate. So what to do? Peaceful coexistence looked very unlikely. What was going to happen? So this is sort of a repeated story here. Those on the outside of mandatory Palestine tended to see some kind of division of this small bit of real estate as the least bad option of trying to solve this dispute between the Zionists, the Jewish population, and the Arab population. This is not like the story of King Solomon. You can, and the baby. You can divide land without destroying it. But those on the inside, those who were the most affected, either rejected the idea of division altogether, or disagreed on where the dividing lines should be, if there was going to be a division. Now, the British toyed with this idea of division in the 30s under the mandate, but the first real attempt at this was in 1947, when the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 181. It divided mandatory Palestine into three sections: a Jewish state, which is this light gray; an Arab state, which is the darker gray; and then an international zone for Jerusalem and the holy sites. The holy sites sacred to the three monotheistic religions. The Zionists, the Jewish population of mandatory Palestine, accepted this with reluctance. They didn't like where the lines were drawn, but they accepted this with reluctance. The Arabs did not. The Arabs and the Arabs from the surrounding states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, etc., prepared for war. And Israel basically won its independence not through the UN General Assembly partition plan, but on the battlefield. And they expanded the territory beyond what was proposed to them in the General Assembly resolution in the Armistice Agreement of 1949. And so the difference between these two maps is what the partition plan was and what the state of Israel, where the state of Israel was after an armistice in 1949, leaving the West Bank under Jordanian administration, the Gaza Strip under Egyptian administration, and then with Israel in the rest. The person that negotiated the armistice agreement, by the way, was an American citizen named Ralph Bunche. Ralph Bunche was a black American who worked for the UN, and he's someone who I wish were better known, because he really had a tremendous career as a black American in the UN in the late 40s. Now, over 700,000 Arab residents of historic Palestine and mandatory Palestine fled or were expelled from what is now Israel. And that's the origin of the Palestinian refugee problem that still haunts us today. I'm sorry, I skipped something. I want to say with the 1949 armistice, Jerusalem was divided. This is the division between East and West Jerusalem. If those of you who've been there, I'm playing not very well with my PowerPoint. This is the famous Y that's in West Jerusalem, across from the King David Hotel. So East Jerusalem, with the old city, was under Jordanian administration, and Israel established its capital in West Jerusalem. As I said, over 700,000 Palestinians either fled or were expelled. That was the origins of the Palestinian refugee problem. And in the first decades of Israel's existence, you also had hundreds of thousands of Jews that had been resident, sometimes for centuries, in Arab lands that either fled or were expelled from Arab lands. And the Jews from the Arab lands make up about 50% of Israel's Jewish population today, they and their descendants. Now, I'm skipping ahead to 1967. In winning what the Israelis called the Six-Day War against combined Arab forces, 7 Arab forces that went against Israel in 1967, Israel seized the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, including the Old City with its sacred sites. And these are the territories, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Old City put a question mark, Jerusalem put a question mark because of that earlier partition plan, but these are the areas that are considered occupied Palestinian territories today. But for Israel, this 1967 war for Israelis has heroic, mythic connotations. With the uniting of Jerusalem, the access of Jews to the Western Wall, the remnant of Herod's temple that had been forbidden under the Jordanian administration. Really the creation of Israel in the 67 war was almost seen as something akin to divine providence after the near annihilation of European Jewry in the Holocaust. Now, needless to say, the Palestinians, backed by the Arab states, at least politically and rhetorically, not so much practically, opposed the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. And their methods locally included passive resistance, commercial strikes, things like that. But externally, there were notorious terrorist incidents, plane hijackings, the massacre of Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics, things like that. So you had this very uneasy situation where the Israelis were administering these areas that were internationally considered occupied Palestinian territories against the will of the population, the local population, and externally, the Israelis were experiencing terrorism, and including from neighboring states, from Palestinian camps in Lebanon and such. Now, I'm mindful of the time. I'm talking, this is a complicated history, so let me skip ahead to the Oslo process of the 1990s. Because this was almost unimaginable at the time, that after terrorism, occupation, etc., that you had Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization recognizing each other on the White House lawn. And the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, major shift in the PLO's position, and Israel recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, after having considered the Palestinian Liberation Organization a terrorist organization and illegal for years. This was revolutionary. And the Oslo process established Palestinian self-rule in the Gaza Strip and cities in the West Bank, and it was intended to lead, sort of step by step, to greater Palestinian power, greater Palestinian autonomy, greater Palestinian territorial control, and greater security for the Israelis. The PLO renounced terrorism And in 1998, they changed the PLO charter to eliminate the clauses that called for the destruction of Israel. I was there when the Palestinians voted to eliminate the charter. President Clinton was there as well. And this was a hopeful moment that unfortunately did not last. The Palestinians who supported the Oslo process, and not all did, but the Palestinians who supported the Oslo process assumed that it was going to lead, in those areas occupied by Israel in 1967, to an independent Palestinian state. But in fact, the Oslo agreements do not mention a Palestinian state. The Oslo process left the status and the borders of this Palestinian self-governing entity ambiguous. The idea was that you deal with issues step by step and build trust, and that will allow the parties later to deal with the really tough issues. What's the status of Jerusalem that both peoples wanted as their capital? What's going to happen with Palestinian refugees whose influx was a demographic threat to Israel's identity? Where are the borders going to be? The idea was leave those things to later. Let's deal with day-to-day living things, day-to-day Palestinian autonomy. But Presidents Clinton, George W. Bush, President Obama, in their own ways, tried to make explicit what was implicit in the Oslo Accords, which was the eventual creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. Side by side in peace and security with Israel. There was a summer 2000 Camp David summit that was hosted by President Clinton. That's the picture that's on the far right. I was there as a young staffer. There was peace parameters that were issued by President Clinton just before he left office, with the ideas of how you would divide this, how you would solve this real estate dispute by a division. George W. Bush had a 2003 performance-based roadmap to a two-state solution. The idea was you would have two states, but that it required certain performance, certain behaviors on both sides to reach that. And then you had President Obama. He had two high-level envoys, former Senate leader George Mitchell, who had done so much to bring about peace in Northern Ireland, as well as Secretary Kerry, who was Secretary of State, working on these things. It all failed. Now, why did this all fail after all this effort? There's plenty of blame to go around. The Palestinians repeatedly rejected what was on offer. They rejected it as being insufficient and ambiguous. They were unhappy with what they saw as Israeli foot-dragging on the Oslo process, and they weren't wrong about that. They were unhappy with what they saw as the continued expansion of Israeli settlements into the West Bank that they thought was going to be the heart of the Palestinian state. They basically feared a trick through these initiatives that the sides were making. I'm looking at this. I was in all three of these meetings when I look at the picture. And in 2001, a violent Palestinian insurgency known as the Second Intifada broke out with repeated terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians. And this torpedoed any Israeli popular support for the peace process. The Israeli support for Oslo was premised on the idea of greater security, not a spike in bus bombings. The Israelis, meanwhile, methodically shrunk the territory theoretically available for a Palestinian state by expanding West Bank settlements, by authorizing new settlements, by building settlement infrastructure such as roads, that cut up the Palestinian territories, and looking the other way as ideological settlers grabbed the hilltops, as they said, to establish new illegal outposts. And so you can sort of see how the West Bank has been cut up by settlements and settlement infrastructure. Palestinians ended up describing the West Bank in some of these meetings I attended as Swiss cheese. How do you build a state based on Swiss cheese? So the Israelis' confidence was destroyed by the Palestinian terrorism, by the security threat. The Palestinian confidence in the process was destroyed by the Israeli building enterprise. Now, under Prime Minister Sharon, the Israelis did disengage entirely from the Gaza Strip in 2005. They still controlled the outside, the entry and exit, but they did redeploy from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Now, I said there's plenty of blame to go around. I blame us too, those of us on the American side that were working on these issues. Because with the exception of condemning terrorism and trying to help Israel deal with the threat of terrorism against Israeli civilians, we Americans didn't really call out or discipline the spoilers in any kind of sustained or meaningful way. The parties got away with undermining those agreements that were celebrated on the White House lawn, with no significant consequences for the spoilers. But the price, of course, was plummeting public confidence on both sides. Now let me go on to my second topic. Let's review the situation today. In the aftermath of Hamas's sophisticated but barbaric October 7th operation, with massacres, sexual violence, hostage-taking, looting, burning, and then Israel's massive retaliation in Gaza, with tens of thousands of killed, hundreds of thousands deprived of basic necessities, and the Gaza Strip becoming basically nearly uninhabitable. Now this is simplistic, but I think you can divide the Israelis and the Palestinians into two groups. Same two groups on both sides. One group believes strongly in the need for peaceful coexistence. And even today, after these horrors of October 7th and afterwards, they're still working heroically, diligently, to try to find ways of peaceful coexistence with each other. Second group are the opposite, those that refuse the other. On the Palestinian side, it's Hamas and its fellow travelers. They want to destroy Israel, not coexist in peace next to it. We saw their methods on October 7th. On the Israeli side, it's these ideological settlers that just keep seizing more land and want to see the Palestinians go away. Now, if you're really going to deal with the peace process, you don't need to deal with these two groups. The first group is going to be with you anyway. The first group yearns for peaceful coexistence. They'll be with you. That second group is never going to be with you. They need to be marginalized and isolated. They're not going to be part of any solution. It's the middle third, which represents the majority. It's the swing vote on both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side that you need to convince that it's worth taking risks for peace. And that middle group right now is in a very bad spot if you want to try to revive a peace process, because that middle group on the Israeli side is traumatized by October 7th, and they're going to be leaning, they may not agree with these ideological settlers, but they're going to be leaning in that way that it's not safe to give concessions to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, that middle group, is going to be looking at what happened in Gaza and looking at what's happening in the West Bank in terms of the settlement activity and saying, we think that Hamas is a better defender of Palestinian interests than the Palestinian Authority that was created by the Oslo process and is committed to a two-state solution. So it's a problem. So consider the juxtaposition. If you're following the news at all, I'm sure you have seen that President Biden, that Congress, that the United Nations, that the Europeans, that the Arab states, there's a whole list of people who suddenly have rediscovered the two-state solution. Two-state solution has been kind of sidelined in recent years. All of a sudden, all these people are talking about we have to go back to the two-state solution in a serious way. It's kind of another miraculous resurrection in the Holy Land. Whereas the local population is more skeptical than ever on both sides of this idea. So you have, again, the outside and inside. Outsiders, let's divide. Insiders say we either reject it or it's no longer viable, one or the other. And let's talk about the leadership for a minute. Take Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister at the time. He is widely reviled across Israel, widely reviled both because of the intelligence and security failures that facilitated October 7th, as well as the polarizing domestic agenda he was pursuing before October 7th. Israeli society was the most divided in its history before October 7th over domestic issues that some of you may have been following. And those divisions are going to pop back again when this war is over. Netanyahu's day of reckoning will come when this war is over. But Netanyahu has a long-standing track record of rejecting the two-state solution. And his arguments for rejecting the two-state solution are going to have more resonance among the Israeli population today than they did before because of October 7th. You know, the Israeli public opinion, again, is shocked by how vulnerable their safe haven, Israel, has turned out to be. Now Netanyahu will try to save his political skin by running against the two-state solution, by saying to the Israelis, I can save you from Joe Biden's crazy idea of a two-state solution, the crazy idea of having a Palestinian state next to us. It's not safe. And he'll cite the 2005 withdrawal of Israeli disengagement from Gaza, which obviously didn't prevent October 7th. He'll talk about the Israeli 2000 withdrawal from southern Lebanon. Israel had occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years, and he'll say, it made us less secure to withdraw from southern Lebanon. It made us less secure to disengage from Gaza. He'll conveniently ignore the fact that the Camp David Accords with Egypt, where the Israelis withdrew from Egyptian Sinai territory, has led to over 40 years of peace. A cold peace, but better than war with Egypt. Then you've got the Palestinian side. PLO chairman, Palestinian Authority head, Mahmoud Abbas, known as Abu Mazen, he's equally reviled by his population. He was last elected in 2005 to a 4-year term, and elections have been continually postponed. Palestinian legislative bodies have completely atrophied. They don't meet. And while Abu Mazen, unlike Netanyahu, does repeatedly state his commitment to a two-state solution, he does not have the credibility, the legitimacy to rally Palestinians around the peace process that they see as so far having only produced more Israeli settlements, more Israeli control, and not steps toward the independence that they aspire to. So in looking ahead, given public opinion on both sides, given the leadership deficiencies on both sides, how does one proceed in rebuilding support for a peace process and a two-state solution that is designed to end the conflict permanently and not simply manage a crisis, the current crisis? This is sort of my third topic. I think that one needs to start by eliminating the alternatives to a two-state solution. And I count 5 alternatives to a two-state solution. First, there's Hamas's idea of a one-state solution, where through violence and war, Palestine replaces Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. This is ethnic cleansing. This is potential genocide. We saw Hamas's methods on October 7th. This is clearly unacceptable, and it plays right into the Israeli fears that what the Palestinians really want is not a state based on those 1967 occupied territories, but a reversal of Israel's independence in 1948, an erasure of Israel altogether. There's the second idea, and so that's clearly unacceptable. The second idea, which is the Israeli settlers' own river to the sea idea, which is requiring the expulsion of millions of Palestinians. And there are current cabinet members in Netanyahu's cabinet that publicly advocate this, and that they're using the war in Gaza as a way to revive this idea of just expelling the Palestinians to where no one seems to want to accept them. And this conjures up for the Palestinians what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, the dispossession and exile that they suffered in 1948-49 with the creation of the State of Israel and the Armistice. It's another example of unacceptable ethnic cleansing. The third alternative to a two-state solution is another version of the one-state option. This is a one-state option where the Palestinians and the Israelis would have equal rights. They would be citizens with equal rights in a unified state from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. And this idea has gained some currency among the Palestinians. It has not gained currency among the Israelis. Maybe a few, I don't know, but in general, it's rejected by the Israelis for a very simple reason. After centuries of persecution, the the Jews in Israel see a Jewish Israel as being essential to their survival. There are about 7.5 million Jews between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. There are about 7.5 million Palestinians, Arabs, between the Mediterranean and Jordan River. So you've got equal, and that 7.5 million Arabs include 20% of the Israeli population that are Arab, mostly in the north. But the Arab population is growing more quickly than the Jewish population, meaning that if you have one state with equal rights for both peoples, the Israeli Jews are going to find themselves in a minority very quickly, and that's unacceptable to them. So the fourth idea is permanent Israeli occupation, where the Israelis have a privileged status and the Palestinians are kept under tight control. Permanent occupation of an angry, a growing, a restive population does not seem to me, anyway, to be a recipe for good security. And it will become even harder for the Israelis to refute the argument that you hear over and over again, that Israel is creating, or has created, and is enforcing an apartheid state. And that would have ramifications for Israel's international reputation, Israel's international connections. I don't think that permanent Israeli occupation is a solution either. And then finally, the fifth alternative to two-state solution is sort of an enhanced status quo ante. Neither peace nor war. For the Palestinians, I think that the enhanced status quo ante is probably impossible given the level of destruction in Gaza. But I suspect this is what many Israelis would like to see. They don't want to see the security intelligence failure of October 7th again. They don't want to see Hamas being able to regroup in a way that threatens the Israelis as it did on October 7th. But they would like to go back to not having to think about the Palestinians, not having to think about occupation, go on with their lives. And by many measures, before October 7th, Israel was doing quite well, without having any kind of peace process, without having to think about the Palestinians. Under the Trump administration, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, two Arab countries in the Gulf, had established diplomatic relations with Israel, established trade relations under what's called the Abraham Accords. The Palestinians were unhappy bystanders, not involved. Under the Biden administration, Saudi Arabia expressed interest in following suit. And you look at the economy of Israel. From 2010 through 2022, Israel's GDP grew by 60%, 60%, without Israel having to make any kind of sacrifice for peace. Yes, there were occasional rocket fires from Gaza and military incursions. There were four Hamas-Israel fights from 2008 up until a couple of years ago, not counting October 7th. But successive Israeli governments found this to be manageable. They referred to the occasional military action in response to Hamas rocket fire as, quote, mowing the grass. You can manage it. You have to do it periodically. So so I think that's what the Israelis would like to see, is a return to where they don't have to think about this. But given October 7th, given the Israeli military response in Gaza after October 7th, the argument that low-level military conflict is less risky than a political solution is no longer convincing. Can Israel really prosper again without peace? October 7th and its aftermath is already prompting a lot of questions among traditional allies and supporters of Israel. Settlement growth is under renewed international scrutiny. Will the Palestinians continue to just tolerate the increased settler violence and settler land grabs that have escalated in recent years, or are we going to see a huge outbreak of violence in the West Bank, such as we did about 20 years ago, that puts Israeli civilians at risk? And what happens when the Palestinian Authority, that Ramallah-based governing authority that was created by the Oslo Accords, simply collapses from its illegitimacy? The Palestinian Authority has basically been a security subcontractor for the Israelis in the Palestinian populated areas of the West Bank. But it's kind of on life support. And do the Israelis really believe that it's in their interest to reoccupy the West Bank cities like Nablus and Hebron and Ramallah that they pulled out of as part of the Oslo process? So it seems to me that we have to make a compelling argument that building an improved status quo is neither desirable nor is it possible, and that all other options are worse than a two-state solution. Israel needs to understand that, yes, it needs to be strong militarily, but it also needs to be flexible diplomatically. The Palestinians need to understand that, yes, they too should have the right to self-determination, but a Palestinian state cannot come into being if it's going to pose a security threat to Israel. I cannot predict how this current war will end. We can talk about some of the details, as I understand it afterwards, if you'd like. I hope that there's a truce and a ceasefire that accomplishes several things. First, free the hostages. This is a war crime. Hamas committed a war crime in seizing and holding these hostages. Second, lower the risk to the Palestinian civilians and allow them to have sufficient humanitarian assistance, not just the bare minimum, which is what they have now, to avert a famine. And then third, to de-escalate regional tensions that really have the risk of turning this horrible but localized conflict into a regional war. I'll talk about the regional aspects in just a minute. But when this war does end, however this war ends, you're going to see incredible divergences between Washington and the Israeli leadership, Washington and the Palestinian leadership. You can already see hints of this if you read the very diplomatically worded words from the White House after President Biden is talking to Netanyahu, or you have Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, seeing Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah. It's not up to us, it's not up to Americans to choose who the Israeli Prime Minister is. And it's not up to us to choose who the PLO chairman is. But it's very hard to imagine how you move forward on a two-state solution with these two guys still in charge. One of them rejects the two-state solution altogether, and both of them lack the popular legitimacy that's necessary to offer compromise and to forge consensus among a skeptical population, both sides of which have been traumatized. And I've been in meetings with these two guys, and I've met with them individually as well. They loathe each other. You don't make peace with your best friends. You make peace with your enemies. But the loathing and distrust is so deep between Netanyahu and Abbas, Abu Mazen, they're never going to be partners for peace. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is playing sort of the diplomatic version of three-dimensional chess. In the short term, they're working with the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Israelis, on how you come up with a ceasefire or truce for Gaza that allows the hostages to be released, or that prompts the release of the hostages, and it increases the humanitarian access necessary in Gaza. That's short term. But at the same time, they're talking about the long term. What happens on the day after? What happens when the war ends? And on this, Saudi Arabia is key. I mentioned earlier that Saudi Arabia had expressed interest in joining these Abraham Accords before October 7th. And had they done so, they would have done so again with the Palestinians as grumpy bystanders. But the Saudi population is extremely pro-Palestinian and horrified by the images that they see of what's coming out of the Gaza Strip. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, wants to diversify his economy, wants to diversify the political connections that Saudi Arabia has. And he sees a relationship with Israel as being part of that diversification, but as leverage with us, to get us to be more interested in a deeper strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia that can help Saudi Arabia strengthen against a threat or potential threat from Iran. But his population is deeply opposed to this right now. So the way, and those of you that studied history, you know that autocrats don't simply, in the most part, they may not allow public opinion to have that much of a role, but they're sensitive to it. They know that there are certain red lines they shouldn't cross. Mohammed bin Salman needs something for the Palestinians in order to justify his desire to build a relationship with the Israelis. So the Saudi price has gone up for the relationship that Mohammed bin Salman wants with Israel, and it also helps with us. So the idea the Biden administration is playing with over the long term is how do you get the Saudis and the other Arabs interested in rebuilding the Gaza Strip and strengthening, revitalizing Palestinian governing institutions and having a stronger relationship with Israel as part of a solution. And one wonders, would Netanyahu really say no if the US comes to him and says, here's the deal. Saudi Arabia is going to recognize Israel. Saudi Arabia is going to establish diplomatic relations, trade relations with Israel. This is historic. This is strategic. This is a strategic achievement. The Saudi Arabia, economically the most powerful country in the Arab world, the site of the two holiest mosques in Islam, would open the door to broader Israeli recognition in the Muslim world. Would Netanyahu say no? Would he choose his right-wing coalition partners and the settlers over that kind of strategic achievement? Maybe. What would the Israeli public do? We'll see. But this is what the Biden administration is doing. Short term, figure out how to get the hostages released, humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Longer term, figure out a way by which you tie the region together in a more coherent way that leads to a more viable, peaceful Palestinian entity that eventually becomes a Palestinian state. Finally, a few words on the region. Regionally, this war has benefited Iran. And it's another reason why I hope that they will come up with a ceasefire or truce soon. Iran loves the idea of Israel being vilified globally. Iran loves the idea that most of the globe has kind of forgotten about the horrors of October 7th, and they're focused on what's happening in the Gaza Strip right now. This is the Iranian narrative, and we're complicit. By the United States providing the weaponry that Israel has used, we are complicit in the methods Israel has chosen. This is the Iranian narrative that most of the globe has come to this conclusion. That serves Iran. Iran doesn't have to vilify Israel because the rest of the world is doing it because of this war. Iran's proxies and partners, from Hezbollah in Lebanon through militias in Syria and Iraq, to the Houthis in Yemen, they are justifying their attacks on support, on solidarity for the beleaguered Palestinians in Gaza. Now, this is cynical. I don't believe that Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah in Lebanon, cares all that much about the Palestinians. I don't believe the Houthi leaders in Yemen care that much about the Palestinians, but their peoples do. There's an Arab solidarity. Their peoples do, and so these Iranian proxies and partners are basically using the Palestinian cause to justify various types of attacks that enhance their local credibility, that show their people, hey, we're in solidarity. We know you're concerned with the Palestinians, and so are we. We're showing our solidarity. It enhances their own credibility with their people. But they do so at the risk of starting a regional war. I think Iran's going to continue to try to probe our own red lines through its proxies and partners. I do not believe Iran wants a war with us. Iran knows that they are weak militarily compared to us, and Iran has enough problems without having a direct war with the United States. Nor do I believe that Hezbollah in Lebanon wants a full-scale war with Israel. Hezbollah has there's an estimate of 150 to 180,000 missiles and rockets aimed at Israel, precision-guided munitions aimed at Israel. But they aren't really about the Palestinians, they aren't really about Lebanon. This is Iran. This is Iran's deterrence. Iran's deterrence against a major Israeli attack on Iran, or Iran's response to a major Israeli attack on Iran. Hezbollah is not going to want to empty its arsenals for the Palestinian cause. They're going to save the bulk of their weaponry for an Israeli-Iranian war. But Hezbollah is also part of this so-called axis of resistance, have to show solidarity with the Palestinians. So what Hezbollah is doing is firing rockets from Lebanon into northern Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces are firing into southern Lebanon in response. So there's a tit-for-tat game that's going on between the two sides. And about 80,000 people on each side of the border, 160,000 people total, had to flee because of this firing back and forth. So far, it's manageable, but there's a real risk that this could turn into a full-scale Israel-Hezbollah war. What if Hezbollah miscalculates, misreads Israeli red lines? What if Israel says, It is intolerable that these 80,000 people in the northern communities cannot go home, safely go home. We're going to have to, despite the risks of a full-scale onslaught from Hezbollah, we're going to have to try to take out their arsenals. So this could turn into a full-scale war that would make a 2006 war between Lebanon and Israel. I was U.S. ambassador in Lebanon then, I know it well. It would make that war look like child's play by comparison. The U.S. and the French have been shuttling between Israel and Lebanon. And they've come up with an understanding by which Hezbollah forces would withdraw a certain distance from the northern border, from the border with Israel. And this would deter an October 7th type incursion into Israel from Lebanon. It's a way for de-escalation, but there's a kicker. Hezbollah has said they'll only do this once there's a truce, once there's a truce or ceasefire, once there's quiet in Gaza. So it's another reason for hoping that there's a truce and ceasefire in Gaza that accomplishes the goals I mentioned earlier. A truce or ceasefire in Gaza, again with the release of hostages with increased humanitarian assistance, would also remove the threat to shipping in the Red Sea. You may have seen that the Houthis in Yemen, down at the bottom, have been firing on commercial ships in the Red Sea. There's the reported incidents are listed. This is probably a little out of date at this point. But the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, up to the Suez Canal, about somewhere between 12 and 15% of global shipping from Asia to Europe goes through, of global shipping, mostly Asia to Europe and Europe to Asia, goes this way. And the Houthis have basically closed that off, meaning you've got greater insurance rates, you've got greater transport costs going all the way around the Horn of Africa, all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, all the way around Africa. The Houthis say they're doing this out of solidarity with the Palestinians. The Houthis, again, are another of these proxy partners with Iran. And in November, when there was a one-week ceasefire, the Houthis suspended their operations. So I suspect that they would suspend them again if there's another ceasefire or truce. Because what they would do is they would claim credit. They're a revolutionary movement. They would pound their chests, have celebrations in the Yemeni cities and say, we let our attacks on commercial shipping is what led to the ceasefire in Gaza. I don't think they would continue the attacks. The vulnerability remains. Insurance is going to remain high, but it's another reason to hope that we get a ceasefire soon to facilitate de-escalation in the Red Sea. Now, let me close, and then I hope we can have some interactive exchange, by expressing concern about how the debate over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has evolved in this country. I'm appalled by how polarized, since October 7th, the discussion has become. How many people look at this conflict as black and white, as zero-sum, as if there's one side that's good and one side that's bad? We should all be horrified by the rise of anti-Semitism in this country, by the rise of anti-Muslim prejudice in this country. We should be guided at home and as we look at the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by what's our shared humanity. It should be possible to mourn both the Israeli children that were butchered on October 7th and the Palestinian children that have been killed since October 7th. We should be able to empathize both with the heartbreak of Israeli families with loved ones killed or loved ones that are still hostage, and with the terror and the sorrow of Palestinians under bombardment, Palestinians who can't find essential supplies for their families. We should be able to support both the right of the Israelis to live in a state of their own in peace and security, and the right of Palestinians to self-determination in their own state. These aren't either-or questions. We should be able to come up with a way to do both. I remember a long time ago, when it still was a hopeful moment in the Oslo process, President Clinton was very much involved in this. And we were at a meeting with President Clinton, and he said, the real goal of what we're trying to do with the Oslo process is to create for the Israelis and the Palestinians the quiet miracle of normal life. And we should be able to help create that quiet miracle of normal life for both sides. Now, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, which have now endured for over 4 decades, came about after the shock of the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, as the Israelis call it, where combined Arab forces in a surprise attacked Israel, again at this point trying to, if not destroy Israel in 73, at least get Israel out of the West Bank. And the Israelis won. And the shock of the Camp David, of the Yom Kippur War within Israel that led to the atmosphere, and the Egyptian defeat too, led to the atmosphere that a few years later enabled the Camp David Accords that are still in place today. That first Palestinian uprising in the West Bank that I mentioned in the late 80s and early 90s, that led to the Oslo process that was initially hopeful and led to that historic recognition between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So it's not going to be easy, but the current war should lead to a solution, just as Camp David was a solution between Egypt and Israel, not another attempt to manage the conflict. If we manage the conflict, just try to put a little things, imagine how bad the next explosion will be. Happy to talk about any of these issues and would love to hear comments, but thank you very much. Yes?
This is a naive question, but I've not seen it or heard it asked yet. Is there any collaboration between the Gazans and the Israeli military forces to turn in or reveal the locations of Hamas and the captives, or is there such bitterness there that doesn't occur at all?
There may be some, but it would be relatively minor. Unfortunately, the support for Hamas has grown because of what's happened. And I think that's a natural reaction. That if you're being attacked, you look at you blame your attackers. You don't. I think that the accountability for Hamas comes after this war, when the Palestinians can look at this whole episode with more sober reflection of how they got into it in the first place. Because yes, Hamas could end this war today if they gave up the hostages and said we're leaving the same way that the PLO fighters left Beirut in the 1980s. But that's not. I don't think any of us, including the Israelis, are very good at dealing with this sort of ideological revolutionary movements. The Israelis set out maximalist demands: destroy Hamas. That's perfectly understandable what happened on October 7th. You want to destroy Hamas. Is that possible as a military option? It's not possible. Hamas has deep roots that's more than just the fighters. Can you degrade Hamas to the point where there's not the type of threat to Israel that there was on October 7th? I certainly hope so. But I think that saying you're going to destroy Hamas is a pipe dream. Destroy it entirely, eradicate it entirely. They said it about Hezbollah before, they said about the PLO before that. But I don't think that you're going to have as much Palestinian sympathy for getting rid of Hamas until this war is over and then people feel that they're moving in a more positive trajectory. The Israelis had. I mean, one of the amazing things for those of us that worked on this issue for a long time was how much we overestimated the Israeli knowledge of the Gaza Strip being. We assumed that through what the Palestinians would call collaborators, that the Israelis would have sufficient contacts, sufficient electronic surveillance, there were often drones above Gaza, that they would have been able to have an inkling that there was planning for something like October 7th. And some people did, it just wasn't acted upon. But I don't think that right now you're going to be able to count on the Palestinians to eject Hamas. Maybe later, I hope so. Yes?
Sir, can you comment on the U.S. naval presence in the Red Sea, and then with that, the Suez Canal? Who is controlling the Suez Canal presently?
Suez Canal's, that's the second one first. Suez Canal's Egyptian. It's been Egyptian ever since the Israelis, French, and British were told by Eisenhower, get yourself out of the Sinai in the 50s. And it's an important source of foreign currency for the Egyptians. So that for the Egyptians, this is a real problem. We all might end up having some supply chain problems or some inflationary pressures, but the Egyptians have a real crisis by not having the transit fees from the Suez Canal, as long as this goes. In terms of the U.S. naval presence, I'm really worried about this. The Houthis. It's another reason why I hope that there's a truce and/or ceasefire soon, so that the Red Sea firing from the Houthis will, and I believe it will, stop. Because the Houthis are using inexpensive weaponry. In some cases, they're using drones to fire on U.S. ships. U.S. ships are using $2 million munitions to fire back to intercept. Those ships only carry so many munitions. The Houthis can just keep firing, and the U.S. is expending very, very expensive munitions. And there's a Chinese ship that's off the coast of Djibouti. There's a Chinese naval base in Djibouti, which is on the other side of the Red Sea. I don't have a map of the whole Red Sea area. And the Chinese are watching. The Chinese are saying, okay, how many interceptions can a U.S. ship do before it has to resupply? This has real implications for us when it comes to if there's ever any kind of war over Taiwan. That the Chinese are gathering, the Chinese are exploiting the Houthi attacks on U.S. ships to gather intelligence on our capabilities and on our supply lines. Worries me tremendously. And the Chinese have a free ride because a lot of this 12 to 15% shipping between Europe and Asia is China, between China and Europe. And China's not paying for any of this protection that the U.S. is leading and trying to protect the Red Sea. Do you invite the Chinese, basically insist the Chinese join you, i.e. give the Chinese a platform for greater blue sea presence? And what does that mean over the long term? Or do you continue to basically subsidize the security for shipping? This is a real dilemma that we have in the Red Sea. And if you're going around all the way around Africa, obviously there's a higher cost to doing shipping. Obviously it takes longer, but it's not just the cost. Imagine that if you have two ships that regularly shuttle between Naples and a port in China, and it's only two ships carrying these goods back and forth for whatever the product company is, and suddenly you have to go all the way around Africa, and you still only have two ships. You're going to have gaps in your supplies. You're going to have gaps in delivery because you don't have it takes longer with this. You have the same number of maritime assets, and it's going to take 3 times as long to go. So this whole Red Sea thing worries me for the global economy and worries me for the long-term intel collection that the Chinese are doing on us. Oh, yes.
So if Israel conducts a military operation against Hezbollah, do you believe this will lead to a greater level of intensity between the axis of resistance in the United States?
It's an excellent question. I think that in that case, Iran is going to assume that we are involved somehow with on the Israeli side, and we will be. We will be supporting Israel's right to self-defense and to push back against the Hezbollah thing, and that by attacking Israel, they're attacking us at the same time. I would expect you're going to see the Shia militias, the Iranian proxies in Syria and Iraq increase the tempo of their attacks on us. I don't think we're going to see anything like an attack on the homeland because the Iranians are going to try to calculate how can they cause the most pain against our interests without provoking us into attacking Iran. So I think yes, you'll see an uptake, but it's not going to be the blowing up of embassies like in Lebanon and the Marines in the 1980s. It's not going to be anything like that. But, oh, yes?
Back to your response to the first question when you had said that.
I'm sorry?
Back to your response to the first question when you had said that on the Israeli side, maybe some people knew about the attacks that were going to happen. Do you feel like in that Netanyahu didn't know that was going to be leverage, and that's why he wasn't acting on it, or who were the people that you're saying knew about that?
I mean, there's a lot of information in the Israeli media, although there's also, Israeli media has censorship now, wartime censorship, so there's less now than there was. But it seems as though that there were people in the Israeli intelligence community that were watching practice. They were watching Hamas rehearse what they were doing on October 7th. They had captured Hamas plans that indicated what they were going to do, without the dates, but indicated the type of brutality that they were not only going to be doing an incursion, they were the type of brutality that they were going to be using in their incursion, which I think was strategically, it was designed to create the type of Israeli response that the Israelis have done. You have the maximum response because then you change the subject away from October 7th. But anyway, but the higher levels in the Israeli government, as I understand it, simply didn't believe that Hamas was going to do this. They thought this was a pipe dream, that Hamas didn't have the capabilities to do it, and that Hamas had become much more interested in governing. That Hamas was the de facto authority in the Gaza Strip. The Israelis were facilitating monthly subsidies, millions and millions of dollars from Qatar into Hamas to cover government expenses. Obviously, much of that was diverted into weapons and tunnels. But the Israelis had been lulled themselves into complacency that Hamas, yeah, it was a pain. We had to mow the grass from time to time. It was basically more interested in governing the Gaza Strip than it was in attacking Israel. Attacking Israel was rhetorical. The other thing that was going on was that the West Bank was heating up at the time, before October 7th. The Netanyahu government is the furthest right government Israel's ever had. And most Israeli governments are not one color. The Israeli political system is very complicated. It's usually a very complicated coalition that governs Israel that may be right-leaning or left-leaning, but has elements of all. This one doesn't. This is far right, including ideological settlers in the cabinet who have called for the expulsion of Palestinians and who have basically enabled settlers to grab land. By October 7th, there were something like 2,000 Palestinians last year, who had been basically terrorized off their land, and their animals seized, their olive trees cut down, the Israeli settlers grabbing their land. And so the fear was the West Bank was about to explode. Many of us, I'll put myself in this category, were warning our Israeli friends, you got to do something about the West Bank, it's going to explode into another major catastrophe, like the Second Intifada of 20 years ago. And so the Israelis had redeployed a lot of their security forces to the West Bank to try to deal with the security threats in the West Bank. They weren't necessarily protecting the Palestinians, but they were trying to keep this community separate. In some cases, there was some bad stuff going on with the soldiers too. But they basically were looking at the West Bank, as were many of us, when the real threat was coming from the Gaza Strip that they underestimated. And I think that the political reckoning for Netanyahu is coming. Netanyahu and Iran have a shared interest in this war continuing. It's a weird partnership that neither would acknowledge. The Iranians like it because it makes us look bad, it makes the Israelis look bad. And Netanyahu likes it because it postpones his day of political reckoning over October 7th. And as a bonus for Netanyahu would like to see President Trump reelected. And if this war and President Biden's handling of it contributes to President Biden losing the election, that's also good for Netanyahu. So you've got this weird, unspoken, unacknowledged partnership that Iran, the people who'd like to see this war continue are Iran and its proxies, and Netanyahu. Yes?
Following up on that, why doesn't Netanyahu want Trump to be elected?
The Trump administration was good for Netanyahu. I mean, the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the embassy. That was something that successive Republican Democratic administrations had always said they were going to do someday, but they always postponed it. And they postponed it as part of the leverage on trying to get to a peace process. The Trump administration said, phooey on that, we're going to recognize Jerusalem, we're going to move the embassy. The Golan Heights, I don't have the map up, the Golan Heights was an area that is internationally considered Syrian, that the Israelis seized in the '67 war. The Trump administration recognized Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. Biden administration hasn't reversed any of this, by the way. But, so the steps that the Trump administration took were favorable to Israel. And also there was the Abraham Accords. It was the Trump administration that brokered these arrangements between Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, Gulf countries, with Israel. Now these countries had quiet relations with Israel already. What the Trump administration did was find ways to bring them out of the closet, bring these relations out of the closet. That was all good for Israel. And the Israelis didn't have to do anything for the Palestinians. So that's, Netanyahu would see the Trump administration as being far more favorable to them than the Biden administration. I mean, frankly, the Biden administration has stood with Israel despite a lot of reasons why it might have questioned some of Israeli methods, but you can see the tension between Netanyahu and Biden. You can see it when you read the media statements from the two sides. Yes?
To what extent do you think this conflict can expand to any progress towards a resolution made in the next few years?
Say that again, please.
To what extent do you think this conflict can expand to progress towards a resolution made?
I think the risks are real. The question was, if there's no resolution, are there risks that this conflict could expand? I think that, yes, I think that it's real. The two parts that worry me the most of the whole regional aspects are the West Bank. Basically, the settlers have been running rampant since October 7th. They feel that they've gotten that they've gotten a green light to seize more Palestinian land, to attack Palestinian villages, to seize Palestinian assets, cut down olive groves, etc. Partly it's probably motivated by revenge, given what happened to the Israelis on October 7th, but partially it's a target of opportunity. Everyone's focused on Gaza. They have a right-wing Israeli government that's pro-settlement in place. Let's move what we can. At some point, the Palestinians in the West Bank, which number about 3 million, are probably going to explode. That worries me. And we suddenly have the Israelis fighting a war in Gaza and having an insurrection in the West Bank. And the last insurrection is the ones that led to all the bus bombings. And the Lebanon thing worries me. And this one, the Lebanon aspect worries me because as I said earlier, I don't think Hezbollah wants a war. Hezbollah wants to symbolize their stand with the Palestinians by firing into northern Israel. They don't want a war. But what if they accidentally hit a school? The Israelis are going to have to respond in a major way. What if they miscalculate where the Israeli red lines are? Or as I said earlier, what if the Israelis say, my gosh, it's been 4 months and tens of thousands, 80,000 Israelis cannot go home to the northern border because it's not safe. We're going to have to deal with the Hezbollah threat come what may. I think, so I worry about the Lebanon-Israel aspects, and I worry about the West Bank. The Houthi thing is really complicated and has global implications in terms of economic, but it's not as it doesn't have the political strategic ramifications that I think that the Lebanon-Hezbollah war would have.
Folks, thank you very much. If you'd like to come up and speak to Ambassador Feltman and ask him some more questions, please do so. So let's give him a round of applause.
Okay.